It started with the lights. Every lamp on the Criterion flickered at the same moment. And then the ship groaned in a way that metal should not groan. And Mara was on her feet, with her rifle in her hands, before the emergency alarm began to wail. The resonance had found them. It came not as a sound, and not as a force, but as a pressure that every psionic mind on the ship felt at once. A wave of influence so strong and so direct that it abandoned the subtlety it had used for millennia, and pushed with everything it had. In the medical bay, a Valesi nurse turned and struck her colleague across the face, without knowing why. In engineering, two Drenari technicians began screaming at each other over nothing, and their forearms locked together in combat, while their conscious minds watched in horror from behind eyes they could no longer control. On the bridge, the navigation officer, a Qatari with 20 years of service, began entering coordinates that would fly the Criterion directly into the dying star. Mara ran through corridors filled with chaos. Aliens who had been calm professionals hours ago were now tearing at each other, and at themselves, and at the walls, and the sounds they made were not the sounds of anger, but of people trapped inside their own bodies, while something else pulled the strings. She felt none of it. The wave passed over her, and through her, and around her, and it found nothing to grip. No telepathic channel to hijack, and no empathic frequency to corrupt, and no psionic doorway to walk through. She was stone in a river, and the river could not move her. She reached the bridge, and found the navigation officer convulsing in her seat, with her tendrils wrapped around the flight controls. And Mara did the only thing she could do. She pulled the Qatari out of the chair, and strapped her down with cargo webbing, and then she manually overrode the navigation input with her own. Codes, the ship steadied. She locked the bridge controls and ran to the lab. Director San was there. The Valesi scientist was on her knees in front of the relic, and all 6 of her eyes were weeping a thin, clear fluid, and her hands were pressed against her skull, and she was whispering in her own language so fast that the universal translator could not keep up. Mara grabbed her by the shoulders and shook her. San's eyes focused slowly, like someone surfacing from deep water, and she looked at Mara, and for the first time there was no condescension in her gaze, and no superiority, and no academic distance. There was only desperation. "It is in our heads," she said. "It is telling us to destroy the relic, and we cannot stop listening." Around them the ship shuddered, and alarms screamed, and somewhere below decks something exploded with a deep thudding boom that Mara felt in her knees. The relic was open. Its interior glowed with that nameless color, and the seat at its center pulsed with light, and the meaning that radiated from it was not subtle anymore. It was urgent. Mara understood what it wanted. The relic contained the full data package of the gardeners. 800,000 years of knowledge compressed into a format that could be downloaded into a single mind. Star maps showing the locations of other hidden caches scattered across the galaxy. Schematics for technology that could shield psionic minds from the resonance. The history of a civilization that had risen and fallen and left everything it had learned inside this one dark box, for the one species that could safely receive it. But the download was not gentle. It had been designed for a mind that processed information without shortcuts. No telepathic compression, and no empathic shorthand, and no quantum-assisted cognition. Just raw, unfiltered biological processing. Electricity and chemistry, and nothing else. It would be like trying to drink an ocean through a straw. Mara looked at the seat, and the seat looked back, and she was afraid. She was more afraid than she had ever been in her life, because she was not brave, and she was not special, and she was not the hero of any story she had ever told herself. She was a security contractor from a planet that the galaxy considered barely worth visiting, and she had taken this job because the money was good, and the alternative was going back to a life that had nothing in it. But the ship was falling apart around her, and the aliens were losing their minds, and the resonance was pushing harder every second, and there was no one else. There was no one else in the entire galaxy. She set down her rifle. She walked to the relic, and she climbed into the impossible interior, and she sat in the chair that had been built for her species 800,000 years before her. Species existed. The surfaces of the chair molded to her body and held her, and the light wrapped around her, and the relic began to close. The last thing she saw, before the dark walls folded shut, was San's face, staring at her through the narrowing gap, with all 6 eyes wide open. Then the download began. It was not information in any way that Mara had ever experienced information. It was memory. The memory of a civilization that had lived for millions of years and had loved the galaxy the way a gardener loves a garden. She saw them, the gardeners, tall and strange and beautiful in a way that had no comparison to anything alive today. She saw them planting life on barren worlds and watching it grow and guiding it toward complexity and intelligence and connection. She saw their joy when the first species developed telepathy, and their pride when empathic networks began linking worlds together in webs of shared feeling. She saw them planting life, growing it, nurturing it, and ultimately celebrating a universe that lived from that connection. She saw their joy. She saw their pride. The resonance arrive, not from outside the galaxy, but from between the spaces where reality was thin. It came like a color that had always existed, but that no one had ever seen before, and it settled into the psionic channels like dust settling into lungs. She felt their growing horror as they realized what was happening. She felt them turn on each other as the resonance pushed, and the trust that had held their civilization together dissolved like salt in water. She felt them build the relic in secret, while their own people fought wars that none of them truly wanted. She felt them seal it and hide it and die with hope as their only remaining possession. Mara screamed. She screamed for most of the 11 minutes that the download took, because a human mind was not meant to hold the memory of a million-year civilization, and every neuron in her brain burned with the effort of containing it. But she held on. She held on because human minds were stubborn and dense and built to survive by refusing to let go, even when letting go would be easier. She held on because that was what humans did. They endured. The relic opened. Mara stepped out, and her nose was bleeding from both nostrils, and her ears were ringing with a high, thin sound, and her hands were shaking so badly that she could not have held her rifle if she tried. But her eyes were clear, and in her mind, sitting in the spaces between her own thoughts, arranged with a precision that would take her years to fully explore, was everything the gardeners had left behind. The maps, and the schematics, and the warnings, and the locations of caches hidden on worlds across the galaxy, and most importantly, the key. The key to building a shield that could protect psionic minds from the resonance. The key to freeing every telepathic and empathic and quantum-sensitive species in the galaxy from an influence they had never known they were under. The psychic assault on the ship stopped. Not gradually, but all at once, like a hand being pulled away from a throat. The resonance withdrew, not because it was defeated, and not because it was destroyed, but because it was surprised. For 800,000 years it had operated without resistance, because every mind in the galaxy was a door it could walk through. And now, for the first time, a mind it could not touch had opened the one box it could not see inside, and had taken the one weapon it could not defend against. It pulled back to consider this development. It would return, but not today. On the Criterion, the aliens stopped fighting, and stopped screaming, and stood in the wreckage of their ship, and blinked at each other with the dazed expressions of people waking from a nightmare they had not known they were having. Mara stood in the lab, with blood on her face and fire in her mind, and she looked at Director San. Still on her knees on the floor, San looked up at her. The Valesi's 6 eyes were red and wet and exhausted, and in them Mara saw something she had never expected to see directed at a human. Respect. Not the grudging kind, and not the political kind, but the real and absolute kind that comes when every assumption you have ever held is burned away, and the truth left standing is something you cannot deny. "I know where we need to go," Mara said quietly. "All of us, together." San looked at her for a long moment. Then the director of the most prestigious archaeological expedition in the galaxy rose to her feet and straightened her robes and composed her 6-eyed face into something resembling dignity, and she nodded. Outside the ship, the stars turned in their ancient patterns, and the dying red sun cast its last light on the dead planet below. And somewhere in the vast dark spaces between galaxies, the Resonance watched and waited. But on the Criterion, a human woman with blood drying on her lip and the memory of gods in her untuned mind stood among the species that had dismissed her kind, and they listened. They listened because she was the only one who had ever truly been free to think her own thoughts. And she was going to teach them how to be free too. The galaxy had always believed that to be connected was to be strong, and that the silent ones were the ones left behind. But the gardeners had known the truth. Sometimes the ones who walk in quiet are the only ones who can hear the things that matter. And sometimes the smallest voice in the room is the only one that is real. The Criterion became a different ship after the message appeared on the screens. The quiet academic atmosphere that had defined the expedition shattered overnight, and what replaced it was fear. Mara could feel it in the way the aliens moved through the corridors faster than before, and in the way they stopped talking when she walked past, and in the way some of them looked at her now, not with the old dismissive pity, but with something new and sharp and resentful. Director San locked herself in her office for 14 hours after the message was decoded, and when she emerged, her 6 eyes were dull and her posture was rigid, and she called a full assembly in the main conference bay. Every crew member attended. Mara stood at the back near the door because that was where security contractors stood, and because she did not want to be in the center of a room full of frightened aliens. San explained the message calmly and precisely, referred to themselves as the gardeners, and according to the relic, they had been the first great civilization in the galaxy, and they had seeded life across thousands of worlds, and guided its evolution over millions of years. They had cultivated intelligence wherever they found it, and they had been especially proud of the species that developed extrasensory abilities, because those abilities represented a higher connection to the fundamental forces of the universe. Telepathy and empathy and quantum resonance were not accidents of biology. They were gifts that the gardeners had nurtured and encouraged because they believed that a connected galaxy was a safer galaxy. They were wrong. Something had come from outside. The relic called it the resonance, and the translation was imperfect, but the meaning was clear. The resonance was not a creature, and not a force, and not a weapon in any way that modern science would recognize. It was an influence, signal that existed on the same frequencies as psionic and empathic and telepathic communication, and it had crept into the galaxy so slowly and so quietly that the gardeners did not notice it until it was already woven into the fabric of every connected mind. It did not control directly. It nudged. A subtle push toward conflict here, a gentle pull away from cooperation there. A whisper in the background of every telepathic conversation that was so faint and so constant that no one questioned it, because it had always been there. It had always been there. The gardeners realized too late that the very abilities they had cultivated across the galaxy were not just communication channels. They were attack surfaces, and the resonance had been using them for longer than anyone could calculate. San paused here, and her voice changed, and Mara could hear the effort it took for her to say the next part. The gardeners could not fight the resonance because they were tuned. Their minds operated on the same frequencies that the resonance used, and trying to resist it was like trying to hear silence while standing inside a bell that never stopped ringing. So they looked for another way. They searched their models and their predictions and their vast understanding of evolutionary biology, and they found a possibility. A theoretical species that might one day arise on one of the many worlds they had seeded. A species that processed the universe entirely through physical senses. No telepathy, and no empathy, and no quantum connection, and no psionic ability of any kind. A species that was completely and totally deaf to the resonance. The untuned. The gardeners built the relic, and they filled it with everything they knew, and everything they had learned about the resonance, and they sealed it with a lock that only an untuned mind could open. And then they died. Could not save themselves. They had already been too compromised for too long, and the resonance had already turned them against each other in ways they could not untangle. But before they fell, they hid their warning, and they trusted the future, and they hoped. 800,000 years later, a species matching their prediction had evolved on a small blue planet orbiting an unremarkable yellow star. Humans. The room was very quiet when San finished. Mara watched the faces of the aliens around her, and she saw something she had never seen before on this ship. She saw them looking at themselves with doubt. A Velesi telepath named Korath stood up, and his voice was tight and controlled, and he asked the question that everyone was thinking. He asked if the resonance was still active. San did not answer immediately, and in that pause, Mara saw the truth before San spoke it. Korath closed his eyes and reached inward into the psionic channels that all Velesi used as naturally as breathing, and he searched for something he had never thought to search for, because it had always been there. The background noise. Every telepath knew it, and every empath felt it, and every species with extrasensory abilities had a version of it. A low, constant ambient signal that existed beneath conscious thought, like the hum of blood in your ears, or the sound of your own breathing. It was so familiar, and so constant, that no one had ever questioned it. No one had ever asked where it came from. Korath opened his eyes, and all 6 of them were wide and bright, with something that Mara recognized, because she had seen it in human eyes many times. Terror. "It is there," he said. "It has always been there." Around the room, other telepaths and empaths began checking for themselves, and one by one their expressions changed, and the fear spread through the assembly like a wave. Of the room, and felt nothing. No signal, and no hum, and no background noise. Just silence. Clean, ordinary silence. She found Tovik afterward in his workshop. The Drenari engineer was sitting on the floor, with all 4 of his arms hanging limp at his sides, and his dark eyes staring at nothing. Mara sat down beside him, and for a long time neither of them spoke. Then Tovik said something that Mara would remember for the rest of her life. He said that every species in the galaxy had looked at humans and seen a people who were missing something. Incomplete, and unfinished, and not quite evolved enough to join the real conversation. He said that the Drenari word for humans translated roughly to the ones who walk in quiet. He said that he had always thought it meant something like the ones who are left out. But now he understood that it meant something very different. It meant the ones the noise cannot reach. Say anything, because there was nothing to say. She just sat beside her friend on the floor of his workshop, while the ship hummed around them, and somewhere in the distance, the relic waited with its impossible interior, glowing, and its 800,000-year-old message finally delivered to the one species in the galaxy that could hear it clearly. Because they were the only ones who could hear anything clearly. Because they were the only ones who had ever truly been listening with their own minds, and nothing else. Tovik reached out with one of his forearms and placed his heavy hand on Mara's shoulder, and he did not say anything kind or patronizing or pitying. He just held on, like someone who had just learned that the ground beneath his feet had never been solid, and the only thing nearby that was real was the small, quiet human sitting next to him. Director San said she would never bring the human into the lab. She said it on day 10, and she said it again on day 11, and on day 12 she ordered Mara into the lab, under full scientific observation, because Yulith San was many things, but above all, she was a scientist, and the data was screaming at her, and she could not ignore it forever. The lab was transformed for the occasion. Every monitoring device the Criterion carried was arranged in concentric rings around the relic, and the walls were lined with sensor arrays and biometric readers, and 3 different species of recording equipment that Mara could not name. Armed guards stood at every entrance because San was not taking chances. Mara was fitted with a neural monitor on her temple, and a cardiac band around her wrist and a respiration tracker clipped to her collar, and she felt less like a participant and more like a sacrifice being prepared for an altar. 12 senior scientists stood behind a transparent barrier, watching her with expressions that ranged from fascination to hostility. San stood at the front, with her 6 eyes fixed on Mara, and her long fingers wrapped around a data tablet. She did not wish Mara luck. She did not say anything kind at all. She simply said, "Proceed." Mara walked into the lab. The relic sat on its platform in the center of the room, dark and smooth, and covered in those impossible tiny etchings. And for a moment, nothing happened. And Mara thought that maybe she had imagined everything, and maybe she was just a tired human with an overworked brain and too much time alone. Then she took one more step, and the relic hummed. It was not a sound that came through the air. It was a vibration that came through the floor and the walls and the bones of her feet, and it rose through her body like a tide coming in, and it filled her chest and her throat and the spaces behind her eyes. Reacted. The Valesi telepaths grabbed their skulls and staggered backward as if something had struck them across the face. The Drenari engineers hissed and dropped to defensive crouches, their forearms spread wide. The Cathari empath Sulin collapsed to the floor and curled into a tight ball, her glowing tendrils flickering like dying candles. But Mara stood still. The hum did not hurt her. It did not overwhelm her, or confuse her, or push her away. It spoke to her. Not in words, and not in images like the vision from her dream, but in something deeper than either of those things. It spoke in meaning. Pure raw meaning that bypassed every system of language and symbol, and went straight into the part of her brain that understood things before it could explain them. And the meaning was this: finally, one who listens with the whole body. Mara's eyes filled with tears, and she did not know why. Began to glow. It started at the base, where the finest lines were carved, and the light was not white and not blue, but a color that Mara had no name for, because human eyes had never been asked to see it before. The glow spread upward along the etchings, like fire climbing a fuse, and the patterns moved and shifted and rearranged themselves as if the surface of the relic was alive and thinking. Then the relic opened. It did not open like a box or a door or any mechanical thing. It unfolded. Layer after layer of its dark surface peeled back and turned and rearranged like paper folding itself into new shapes, and the movement was so smooth and so precise that it looked less like engineering and more like breathing. The interior that was revealed should not have fit inside the exterior. Mara knew enough about physics to know that, and the gasps from the scientists behind the barrier confirmed it. The space inside the relic was larger than the object itself by a factor that the instruments would later calculate at roughly 11 to 1. and in the center of that impossible interior space, there was a seat. It was shaped like a chair, but curved and contoured, and fitted with surfaces that looked soft and yielding, and it was surrounded by structures that pulsed with that same nameless light. The proportions of the seat were not Velesi. They were not Drenanari or Cathari or any of the dozen other species on the ship. They were human, not approximately human, and not close enough to human. They were exactly, precisely, perfectly human, as if someone 800,000 years ago had measured a human body that did not yet exist, and built a chair to hold it. The lab was completely silent. Sans stared at the seat, with all 6 of her eyes wide open, in an expression that Mara had never seen on a Velesi face before. It was shock, and beneath the shock, buried deep where a lesser observer might not have seen it, was the first crack in a certainty that had defined her entire life. The certainty that humans were lesser. Sans' voice came through the speaker system, thin and controlled. No one enters the artifact. Mara nodded and stepped back, and the relic remained open, its interior glowing with patient light, as if it had all the time in the universe, because it did. That night, no one slept. The science team argued and analyzed and ran simulations and argued again, and Mara sat in her quarters and pressed her hand against her sternum, where the pull lived now like a second heartbeat. At 0300 hours, ship time, every screen on the Criterion went dark. Then they all turned on at once, displaying the same image. A map. Not a map of the galaxy as it existed now, but as it had existed 800,000 years ago. Stars that had long since burned out were marked in bright points, and clusters that had collapsed into nothing were shown in their ancient glory, and among them scattered across the spiral arms were symbols. Thousands of symbols marking locations and civilizations, and something else. Something that the ship's translation AI struggled with for several minutes before producing an imperfect rendering of the message that accompanied the map. The gardeners left a warning. Only the untuned can carry it. The tuned were already compromised. The words hung on every screen in every room on the ship, and Mara read them from her bunk, and felt the pull in her chest tighten into something that was almost pain. The untuned. She understood what it meant before the scientists figured it out, because the relic had been speaking to her for days, and some part of her had already been listening. Every species in the galactic community had some form of extra sense, telepathy or empathy, or quantum sensitivity, or biological resonance. Every species, except humans, perceived the universe through 5 basic senses and nothing more. No psychic channels, no empathic frequencies, no connection to the background hum that every other intelligent race considered as natural as breathing. Humans were deaf and blind to an entire dimension of reality, and every alien civilization had looked at that absence and seen a deficiency, a gap, a flaw in an otherwise unremarkable species. But the precursors who had built this relic 800,000 years before the first human had ever looked up at the stars had not seen a flaw. They had seen a door that could not be opened from the outside, and they had built their most important message to fit through it. Mara did not mention the pull to anyone, because she had learned a long time ago that humans who reported strange feelings on alien ships were not taken seriously. They were given medical scans and sympathetic looks, and then reassigned to cargo duty. So she kept her mouth shut and went back to her rotations, and stood in her corridor, and watched the scientists fail to make the relic do anything at all. But she could not stop watching it. Every shift she would glance through the observation window, and every shift she would notice something that made her stomach tighten. The relic had moved, not dramatically and not in any way that a casual observer would catch. But Mara was not casual about anything, and she had spent 6 months memorizing every detail of this ship out of sheer boredom. On day 5, the relic was 4 millimeters closer to the east wall of the lab. On day 6, it had shifted again, this time toward the north. On day 7, Mara realized, with a cold clarity that made the hair on her arms stand up, that the relic was not drifting randomly. It was moving toward whatever wall was closest to her. She tested it quietly on her own, walking different routes to her post, and checking the relic's position through the window each time. When she approached from the south corridor, the relic was slightly closer to the south wall. When she came from the upper deck and passed above the lab, she could not check visually, but the next time she looked, the relic had shifted toward the ceiling side edge of its platform. It was tracking her. She sat with this knowledge for 1 full day, and it sat in her chest like a stone. Then she went to Tovik. The Drennerai engineer was in his workshop, surrounded by disassembled sensor modules and humming a low tune that vibrated in the bones of Mara's skull. She told him what she had observed, and she kept her voice flat and calm because she knew that sounding emotional would make him dismiss her faster. Tovik listened with his forearms still and his dark eyes narrowed, and when she finished, he let out a long breath through the slits in his throat. He did not laugh at her. He pulled up the internal lab sensors on his console and ran a positional analysis on the relic for the past 72 hours, and his 4 hands went completely still. The drift was real. Tiny movements measured in fractions of millimeters, but consistent and directional, and every single vector pointed toward wherever Mara had been standing at that moment in time. Tovik looked at Mara, and for the first time since she had known him, the kindness in his eyes was replaced by something sharper, something like fear. He reported the findings to Director San, who received them the way she received all information that contradicted her assumptions, which was badly. She accused Tovik of sensor error, and then she accused Mara of tampering, and then when neither accusation held up, she went very quiet, and her 6 eyes blinked in a pattern that Mara had never seen before. San ordered a controlled experiment. Mara would walk a specific loop through the corridors surrounding the lab, while internal sensors tracked the relic in real time. The entire science team gathered to observe. Mara felt like a lab animal, which was not a new feeling on this ship, but today it was worse, because today even the aliens who usually ignored her were staring. She walked the loop, slowly and steadily passing along the south corridor, then turning east, then north, then west, while the sensors recorded everything. In the lab, the relic rotated on its platform, not quickly and not violently, but with a smooth, deliberate motion, like a flower turning to follow the sun. It tracked her perfectly. When she stopped, it stopped. When she moved, it moved. When she reversed direction, it paused for exactly 2 seconds, and then reversed with her. The lab was silent, except for the hum of machines and the sound of Mara's boots on the floor. 57 alien scientists, representing 12 different species, stood in that silence and stared at the data on their screens, and not one of them said a word. The most ancient artifact ever recovered by the consortium had been tested by the finest minds in the galaxy, and it had ignored all of them with the indifference of a mountain ignoring the wind. And now it was following a human security guard like a lost animal that had finally found its owner. Director San ended the experiment and ordered Mara to stay at least 50 meters from the relic at all times while the team analyzed the results. Her voice was controlled, but Mara could see something in the tight way she held her long fingers. Not just confusion, offense. The idea that this ancient thing, this treasure of a civilization older than anyone could comprehend, had chosen the human over the Valesi, was not just a scientific puzzle to San. It was an insult. Mara obeyed the order because she was a contractor, and obedience was what she was paid for. She moved her patrol route to the far side of the ship, and she ate her meals in her quarters, and she stayed away from the lab, and she tried not to think about the pull in her chest that had not gone away. It was getting stronger. Not painful, but persistent, like a sound just below the edge of hearing that she could feel in her teeth. On the 9th night, she went to sleep in her bunk, and the sleep came fast, which was unusual. And then the dream came, and it was not a dream at all. She stood on a vast dark plain that stretched in every direction without end. There was no horizon, and there were no stars, and the sky above was not black, but empty in a way that black could not describe. And something was looking down at her. Not see it, and she could not hear it. But she knew it was there, the way she knew her own heartbeat was there. It was enormous and old and patient, and it was studying her with an attention so total that it made every cell in her body vibrate. She woke up gasping. Blood was running from her nose in a thin, warm line down her upper lip, and her sheets were soaked with sweat, and her hands were shaking. She pressed her fingers to her face and stared at the red on her fingertips. That had not been a dream. She had not imagined it, and she had not created it. Something had sent that image to her. Something had reached across whatever barrier existed between the relic and her mind, and had placed that vision inside her head, as carefully as someone placing a letter on a doorstep. The relic was not just tracking her, it was trying to talk to her. And Mara, sitting alone in her small bunk on a ship full of beings who considered her barely worth noticing, was the only one in the galaxy who could hear it. The ship was called the Criterion, and it drifted through a region of space so old that even the stars here looked tired. Mara Castillo stood in the corridor outside the main research lab, with her pulse rifle resting against her shoulder, and her boots planted on the cold metal floor, and she was bored out of her mind. She was not a scientist, and she was not an explorer, and she was not any of the grand things that the aliens on this ship like to call themselves. She was a security contractor, a human one. And on this ship that meant she was somewhere between a janitor and a pet. The Criterion belonged to the Galactic Antiquities Consortium, which was a fancy name for a group of very old and very proud alien species who dug up ancient things from dead worlds and then argued about what those things meant for the next 100 years. Mara had been assigned to the crew 6 months ago because regulations required at least one armed escort during deep space recovery missions, and because humans were cheap to hire. Director Eulith San ran the expedition, and she was a Valesi, which meant she was tall and thin and had 6 eyes arranged in a crown around her smooth skull, and she moved like every step she took was a gift to the floor beneath her. San had spoken directly to Mara exactly 4 times in 6 months, and 3 of those times had been to tell her to stand somewhere else. The 4th time had been to ask if humans truly could not sense the psychic background hum of the universe. And when Mara had said no, San had looked at her the way someone might look at a chair that had briefly been mistaken for a person. Then there was Tovik, the Drenari engineer, who had 4 arms and skin like dark green stone, and a laugh that sounded like gravel rolling downhill. Tovik was kind to Mara in the way that people are kind to dogs, and Mara had decided that this was the best she was going to get on this ship. 3 days ago, the Criterion had arrived at a dead planet, circling a dying red star. The planet had no name because it had never had anyone to name it, and its surface was nothing but dust and silence and ancient craters. But beneath the surface, buried under 2 kilometers of rock, the survey drones had found something. A vault. And inside the vault, sealed behind doors that had not opened in 800,000 years, they found the relic. It was brought aboard the Criterion with great ceremony, and Mara had watched from the corridor as the science team floated it into the lab on a gravity platform, like priests carrying a coffin to an altar. The relic was dark and smooth and roughly the size of a human coffin, which Mara thought was a strange coincidence. Its surface was covered in tiny etchings, so small and so precise that no scanner on the ship could fully read them. The energy signature from inside it was faint the steady heartbeat that had been beating for almost 1,000,000 years. Director San called it the most significant find in the history of the consortium, and for the first 2 days, the entire crew was electric with excitement. Every species on board wanted to be the first to make it respond. The Valesi telepaths went first because they always went first. They sat around the relic in a circle and closed their many eyes, and reached out with their minds the way they reached into everything, and they found nothing. Not silence exactly, but something worse. A wall so smooth and so total that their thoughts slid off it like water off glass. They tried for 6 hours and came away shaking and confused. Next, the Drenari engineers tried their approach. Tovik and his team bombarded the relic with every frequency they knew, and some they invented on the spot. Sound waves and light pulses and magnetic fields and even gravitational nudges. There and did absolutely nothing. A Kithari bioempath named Sulin tried to bond with it organically, pressing her soft glowing tendrils against its surface and attempting to commune with whatever life force might still linger inside. She pulled away after 30 seconds and said it felt like touching a wall at the edge of the universe, cold and final and completely indifferent to her existence. By the end of the 3rd day, Director San was pacing the lab with her 6 eyes blinking in frustrated patterns and her long fingers clasped behind her back. She began drafting a preliminary report, classifying the relic as a passive monument, which in consortium language meant impressive but useless, a very expensive piece of ancient furniture. Mara watched all of this from her post in the corridor, because that was her job. She had no opinion about ancient artifacts or the feelings of frustrated alien scientists. She was there to make sure nobody stole anything or broke anything or killed each other over academic disagreements, which had apparently happened twice on previous consortium missions. On the 4th night, Mara was on the late rotation. The corridor was empty, and the lights were dimmed to simulate a night cycle, and the ship hummed with the quiet sounds of recycled air and distant engines. She stood outside the lab and stared at nothing and thought about the apartment she had left behind on Earth, and the cat she had given to her sister, and the paycheck that would be waiting for her when this contract ended. And then she felt something. It was not a sound, and it was not a touch, and it was not anything she could have described to a Valesi telepath or a Qatari empath. It was a pull, a faint, impossible tug behind her sternum, as if someone had tied a thread to the inside of her chest and given it the gentlest tug. She turned her head slowly and looked through the observation window into the lab. The relic sat on its platform in the dim blue glow of the standby lights, and Mara could have sworn that it was closer to the glass than it had been that morning. She stared at it for a long time. The pull faded and the feeling passed, and she was left standing alone in a quiet corridor on a ship full of aliens who thought she was furniture. She told herself it was fatigue. She told herself that she had been standing too long and eating too little, and that human brains did strange things when they were bored and lonely. She turned away from the window and finished her shift and went to her bunk and lay in the dark with her hand pressed against her sternum where the pull had been. She did not sleep for a very long time, and in the lab behind the sealed doors and the observation glass, the relic sat in the dark, waiting, the way it had been waiting for 800,000 years. But now, for the first time in all those centuries of silence, it was waiting for someone specific.